Welcome back to Chicagolandians, a casual Chicago sports podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined by my co-host, Connor Cunningham.
We're two brothers from the Chicagoland area talking about the latest and greatest in Chicago sports news.
Welcome back to another episode of the Chicagolandians. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined as always by Connor Cunningham.
Hello, hello, hello.
On today's episode, we are not going to be talking about the Bears' tragic loss to the AZ Cardinals this week.
As much as we would want to.
Or are we going to talk about Illinois football's tragic loss to the Minnesota football team? Are they the Gophers? What team are they?
Golden Gophers, baby.
Golden Gophers. The focus of today's episode is going to be on the NFL's future, specifically with international expansion. What that looks like. Are we excited about it? This is another one of those kind of researchy videos that we took some time to
dives.
Take a little bit of a dive in a topic. Turned out to be pretty interesting, exciting, a lot of things to think about, and I think will hopefully lead to some fruitful discussion. But before that, let's just cover some...
I just want to jump in real quick.
Oh, yeah.
Fun deep dive trivia. Do you know famous Hollywood actor Jason Statham was a diver in a past life? He was a competitive diver.
Whoa. Competitive diver as in like style diving or depth diving?
Style diving. He probably did go pretty deep into the water when he would
You
do
don't
his
see a lot
dives,
of depth divers. You don't see a
that's
lot of
less
those
popular.
It's
But
very
he would
niche.
do a lot of the flips, yeah.
Wow. Okay. I could see that. He seems like a guy that could get real skinny. Really hit the tuck or a pike. Okay. I can believe that. Well, thank you for bringing that to my attention.
We can move on. Yeah.
Okay. But the first piece of news we have, we're going to cover from a high-level overview. We're going to talk about the Bears. Like we said before, just lost to the Arizona Cardinals, unfortunately, in a game that, not the end of the world, but was certainly a kind of a get-right game. After that Commanders loss, it was this point where we said, okay, we can either let that game define the rest of the season, or we can say, hey, we almost came out and won that game. Let's use that as momentum to destroy the Cardinals and eventually the Patriots. And we decided to go option A in that scenario and get absolutely shellacked by the Cardinals.
Trounced.
And we still
Cardinals
lost.
currently number one in the NFC West right now. But I agree, not a very talented team. We should have won that game.
Yeah, absolutely. And this game really brought to the front of everyone's mind, somehow more than last week, should Matt Eberflus be fired immediately? Should he have already been fired? It certainly made you think that Eberflus had lost the locker room, which is like the main thing that we keep him around for, is because the players apparently respect him, right? Despite being 2-7 at one point last year, he was able to keep the locker room and finish strong through the season. And now it's just it was a sad game, but this was the first game that I felt like I am wasting my time watching this game this season.
Yeah.
Which was rare because it's always so exciting to see Caleb, but this one really felt like we were out of it at the start of the third quarter. I felt like we were out of it. It sucked.
Yeah, I agree. I think your point put it very well. So we were 4-2 entering against the Commanders, lost a tight game that we were 2 seconds away from winning. That would have put us at 5-2. And I feel like instead of taking that and building on that, or we're totally feeding into what the national media has said about us, what the media was saying before the season started about the underlying holes in our roster. Sunday was a complete collapse, a very not Bears game that we've had lately. We gave up the most points that we've given up the entire season. The Cardinals have the 26th worst defense in the NFL. We could only muster 9 points against them. James Conner, Amari DeMarcado, and Trey Benson ran for 213 yards on us. It was very embarrassing. And I feel like it's so crazy that we're sitting at 4-4 now, and people want to paint the season as over, which other teams are sitting at 4-5 or 4-4, and it's a totally different dynamic. They don't have the same feeling that the Bears have, even though we're sitting at the same record. And the Bears should be happy to be at 4-4 with a rookie quarterback, even though this is a very talented roster overall. There's growing pains that come with a rookie quarterback that was to be expected, right? But I think the difficult part is to watch so many games that we've had come down to coaching and less on players and talent, especially the Colts game and the Commanders game. So the depression or the sentiment around the season, it's so jarring to be sitting at 500 and still feel like we've stunk, right? And I think it's disappointing that that's the outlook that we have right now. I will say again that I do not think that there's a lot that we need to panic about in terms of roster construction or in terms of Caleb Williams or Odunze. I think that there are obviously holes that we have on this team. I think that Holes has not done a good job of addressing the offensive line. I think that's something that we can fix moving forward. But in terms of wide sweeping, we've been living a lie for the past year and a half. I don't buy into that at all. I don't buy into the fact that we should have drafted Jaden Daniels instead of Caleb Williams. I still believe in Caleb Williams. Of course, I would say if you're out on Caleb Williams now, you were never in on him in the first place. So I think everyone does need to relax about what's going on in the season. I do still believe that Eberflus and Waldron are not the right guys, and I still believe that they should move on. But to throw up and give the entire season up is a very Bears loser mentality, and it's very frustrating to watch. I will say the Bears have never fired a coach in the middle of the season. I don't know if a team has ever fired a coach in the middle of a game, a la Vontae Davis, who retired, RIP Vontae Davis, retired in the middle of a game. I think the Bears could maybe fire Matt Eberflus in the middle of next game if we start dropping against the Patriots. But overall, it was just a very disappointing game because it seemed like a turning point in the season where we could either let Jaden Daniels and Noah Brown own the rest of our season or say, put that behind us. And this seemed like a great opportunity for Matt Eberflus to flex his people leadership skills and to show that he really is a leader of men and keeping this team together. And it seemed like we weren't able to do that. This game seemed very much like a lack of effort from players and less of a lack of coaching. Moving forward, I hope we can be better. This game was a very winnable game. The Patriots are an even more winnable game. And then the schedule kind of gets harder, but
this is going to be our easiest game for the rest of the season, right? This Patriots game.
Yeah. Probably, yeah. But people are saying oh, the Bears might not win another game the entire season after this, which is fair, but to chalk up 6 division games as 6 losses and to assume that we're going to lose every game that we have moving forward is insanity. It's so exhausting. Listening to everybody be so upset about the season, man. It's exhausting. The Packers looked terrible this week against the Lions. I agree the Lions do look like the best team. The Vikings have looked beatable for sure at times. And the other games that we have in the season aren't that insane. I think we're going to be on the edge of playoff contention. I think that we'll shoot for 8 to 9 wins. I still think that can happen, but it's just frustrating.
Yeah, so 4-4, we've got 9 games left. You win half of those, you finish.
You tell me we can't split? Yeah.
Yeah, we finished 8 wins. That's one more win than we had last year, right? Sign of improvement. And there is such a loser mentality from Bears fans that we feel we are not deserving to have any wins. We don't think we should be good forever. And it is so sad. And I am at fault. I think that a lot. But it is so sad to think of all of this talk of the cycle of the Bears quarterback and the coaching and the hamster wheel that we were doomed to repeat, drafting young quarterbacks, hiring coaches, firing coaches, rinsing and repeating. And to sit and think that that is the outlook, that is so depressing, and we need to break out of that cycle and have some gosh dang hope. We have the most exciting player on the Bears that we've had since, I don't know, Devin Hester, maybe ever, and a top 10 receiver. This is the most exciting time to be a Bears fan in 20 years since we made the Super Bowl. Oh my gosh. It is understandable, though. It is tough to see a guy like Caleb. You're afraid of what Eberflus is doing, especially leaving him out there in not a blowout game, but a game like 2 minutes left. We're losing that game. I don't want him back. I don't want Caleb out there. Why is he out there?
Oh my gosh. That was ridiculous. That leaving him out there. And then Eberflus went back onto the interview and was saying the Chicago Bears are always going to compete in every situation that we're in. But that was ridiculous. We were down 20 points. We did have, I think, all 3 timeouts, but the opening play that we had on that drive was a pitch play to Roschon Johnson, not outward facing, not towards the sideline. We run another pass over the middle, and then we run a screen pass to Roschon Johnson again over the middle. The final route concepts that we had that drive, none of them were outbreaking towards the sideline. The Bears were not
we were not competing.
We were not competing. We were trying to get to the end of the game. That was so infuriating to see him try to sit there and honestly think that we were trying to compete or like win the game. We were running the clock out. We were putting up a facade that we were trying to compete by passing the ball, but the design was nothing short of just trying to get rid of the clock.
You are seeing one thing so clear and obvious, and Eberflus is telling you this was his plan all along, and it is infuriating. But let's move on. So just to cover briefly, Illinois football lost to the Minnesota Golden Gophers, and honestly, kind of a similar loss to the Bears' loss to the Cardinals. We have a tough loss to the number one team in the nation, Oregon, and we follow that up by losing to unranked Minnesota. Just a sad loss. I still think Illinois will be able to scrape out 7 or 8 wins, get a bowl game. Certainly not a playoff team, but just frustrating. Just bad vibes in Chicago sports right now, in Chicago football right now. Connor, you have any notes about that game?
No, I mean, not too many notes. It was just a very frustrating game. Again, just because it was very reminiscent of our 2022 season where, we started off so hot, we beat Wyoming, we dropped the tough game to Indiana, but then beat Virginia, Chattanooga, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. We had all these hot games. We beat Nebraska. And then when you start to just tick away these poor losses, it's very bad when you drop a bad game to Oregon and then drop the next game. It's really sad to see. But I think where the football program is now compared to where it was in the past, still something to be excited about. I think the program's not where it needs to be in terms of competing nationally, especially seeing how great Indiana's been with one coaching change, but bad loss. You never like to see a team take 2 steps back when they should have taken 1 step back, 2 steps forward,
Absolutely. Well, on a more positive note, Illinois basketball started this week also on Monday. We played Eastern Illinois. Looked good. I think we scored like 112 or 120 or something. Put up an insane number. Will Riley, our freshman, had 30 buckets, I think. He looked insane. It's going to be an interesting season. We've got a very young roster, a lot of freshmen that haven't spent a lot of minutes playing together, which is not our traditional Illinois basketball culture, right? We always have veterans that have been there forever to help lead the team and kind of a system. So it's going to be interesting to see how this new team plays together.
Yeah. No notes for me. Very excited to have the season starting again. It'll be interesting to see how the team gels together. Will Riley looks solid. But yeah, no notes for me.
Next thing, we've got Bears at the trade deadline. Did not make any moves, except we traded running back Khalil Herbert to the Cincinnati Bengals for a 7th round pick. Khalil Herbert, I will say, not a great run blocker, but he had juice. I will sit here and I will defend Khalil Herbert. Had juice, and I hope he does. I wish him all the best. I think he's a talented running back that'll hopefully have more success. We didn't use him at all this year. Hope he finds a role in the Bengals. I know Zach Moss just got hurt, right? I think he's out for the season. Chase Brown is now the starting running back, but definitely needs a change of pace or a backup that I hope Khalil Herbert can be. But moving on, last piece of news we have, just real quick, we have the Bulls are now surprisingly 3-4. People have projected this year to be pretty bad, but I think, as I mentioned last week with this season, how it's a strategy of ideally tanking for Cooper Flagg, but I think we're seeing already that we are, in classic Bulls fashion, too talented and undecided in what our identity is. Because just recently we dropped Modest Buzelis, the 11th overall pick in this draft, dropped him down to the G League, and Zach LaVine and Vucevic are getting the most minutes on our team. Seems like we can't figure out if we're trying to compete this season or if we're trying to tank and rebuild this season in classic Bulls fashion. We're trying to always compete instead of being bad. I mean, it's like this roster is not good enough to make a deep run into the playoffs, right? So it's like,
it never is.
Why are we bothering to be competitive? Lonzo Ball also sprained his wrist. This guy cannot stay on the court. I don't
What
want
is
to say
the
too
latest
much bad.
update on the injury?
I think it was a 10-day thing that I think he'll come back from. And I don't want to say too much bad stuff about him. I love Lonzo Ball. He's a great player and really crucial to this team. It's just frustrating to see him have so many injuries. Connor, any notes on the Bulls?
Well, I think just in general, I noticed from editing this podcast and being a host on this podcast, I noticed probably one of the most used words that we have is frustrating and frustrated. There's a few phrases that we say more than it's just frustrating. And I think that's telling of where we are in Chicago sports right now. It's just a tough, frustrating time.
We have too much pride with the Chicago Bulls to tank Jerry has this perfect strategy for making the most amount of money while spending the least amount of money, and that's what it's going to be. And we can't.
I don't even get it. Like, I know Jerry is all about if you're 500, people will still show to the games. But Jerry also owns the White Sox. And we've gone to White Sox games. No one's at those games. Maybe I don't know ball well enough, but it seems like he's not implementing that strategy across his Chicago teams equally.
No, doesn't seem like it. Nobody's going to the Sox games unless it was our 120th loss game.
Oh, sold out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we're now going to move to the main meat and potatoes of this episode, which is international expansion of the NFL. I think in the last couple of years, we've started to see more and more games internationally and also in Mexico and Brazil. And it starts to really make you think, oh, what would that look like if we had an international team? And then with the talks of moving towards an 18-game season, the possibility of moving a team to London has seemed more and more like a possibility. So I wanted to take a deep dive into what that would look like and what the NFL has tried previously to make something like this happen. But just to kind of kick things off, Roger Goodell, who's the current commissioner of the NFL, he has a goal by 2027 to reach
Roger 2027
to reach revenue of $25 billion. But the United States population is limited. We only have so many TVs here, and to continually expand and grow our revenue, you got to expand internationally.
You're not growing, you're dying.
Exactly.
You're not growing, you're dying. That's what I like to say.
Exactly. But before we jump into what it looks like now, walk the clock back all the way back to 1910, which was the NFL's first experience with a game in London. There was just American soldiers next to some Air Force bases, and they said, hey, how about two of us get a team together? Let's start playing against each other.
For details on that match, it took place on November 23rd, 1910 in Crystal Palace, London, which is what the Ted Lasso AFC Richmond is based off of. The team was made up of the USS Idaho, and they defeated the USS Vermont 19-0. A statement victory for USS Idaho.
And they would continue that momentum on for generations. Following that, in the 1950s, we're going to skip about 40 years, we had the U.S. Air Force Europe Sports League. I think that name could use a little massage.
Another revision.
Another pass through. But in the 50s, U.S. Air Force bases organized several football games, which culminated in the 1951 championship in Wembley, which apparently attracted thousands of local fans. But NFL football didn't really start to be taken seriously until a little bit after that in more the 80s, early 90s, and the 2000s eventually. In the 80s, we had what was called the American Bowl, which was...
Awesome.
Yeah, perfect. Which was preseason games. And one of the first matchups we have here is the 85 Bears played the Cowboys in Wembley, and we played in front of a packed stadium. That 85 Bears team would go on to win the Super Bowl and be the best Bears team ever. Connor, you have any notes about these early forms of European football?
Yeah, I think the first thing was realizing how old football was. I thought it was a joke when I read this, saw this in a video about 1910 playing football.
That's insane.
And then for it to be in, I guess it's World War I times, I guess it makes sense around the 1910s, but just so bizarre. And then to think about how irrelevant football can seem in Europe now, to think about its place in the 50s, the kind of public perception of what American football, I couldn't imagine what that would be like. And then finally in the 80s to have the American Bowl seems so awesome. That's the best name. And to send the Cowboys across the pond, I just love that vibe. To kind of package the United States in a little 3-hour package and say, this is America, football, Cowboys, Bears, here you go. And I think it seemed like, at least in the early days, that people in London and the UK were just eating that American Bowl up, American Bowl soup.
They couldn't get enough of it. And then following the American Bowl, we have what was called NFL Europe, was eventually rebranded to NFL Europa.
So actual note, originally started as the World League of Football.
Yeah.
Which included teams in Europe, South America, and North America. It was then rebranded and reduced to the NFL Europe League, and then was renamed again to NFL Europa. So we kind of started big breadth World League of Football. We're going to
Got
take over
wide,
the world of
wide.
football. Kind of move the goalposts and said, all right, maybe NFL Europe League. And then we thought, you know what? NFL Europa. That's what we're going to settle on.
Yeah. So this league was kind of a development league to hopefully promote the sport internationally, but then also develop some good players to play in the NFL. And it kind of worked. There's some notable players. Kurt Warner actually played in this league. Pretty sure Adam Vinatieri also played in this league.
Yeah.
Like some real NFL legends got their start in this league. But unfortunately, NFL Europa, incredibly unsuccessful. Lost $30 million every single year, despite fans being excited for football. It could not beat out their love for other sports like soccer and rugby. I think there was a stat that said soccer now, compared to football in Europe, is 25 times more popular. And that's nowadays. So think about in early 2000s, you can't imagine trying to compete with it. So plagued by these huge losses, when Roger Goodell eventually took over around 2006, one of the first decisions that he made was getting rid of...
Took NFL Europa behind the shed.
and sent it off to the farm. Yeah. And said, no more of this. We're going to stop losing $30 million every year, which paved the way for the regular season international games from 2005 up until now. Connor, do you want to cover this section?
Yeah, I think covering the original times of NFL Europa, I think it's just very interesting hearing about it, especially now with the AFL and the USFL, these spring leagues that kind of develop. It's very interesting to hear about, to kind of look at these systems that were in place. There were some funny stats about the Barcelona Dragons, who were a NFL Europa team that I believe a few weeks before the season started, they did not have their head coach hired yet.
I heard they didn't have a roster assembled yet. I heard they didn't have players. Struggles.
Yeah. So just hearing kind of about this hodgepodge of football, I think is funny. I think also the main issue with NFL Europa, you're trying to expand the NFL and bring to people who have not seen football before the beauty of football. But the issue is that you're showing them a crappy version of football by sending off not very good players to showcase the sport. I know Kurt Warner was produced from it, but I think it was a combination of one, people not being that into football, and two, the actual product that they were showing was just not that great. And I think overall, it's just kind of funny to hear about these expansions that they tried to make early on. But moving on from there, he started an international plan pretty quickly, less of international integration, as in implementing leagues, but more of just showcasing the NFL and showcasing the talent that was present in the NFL. So we had our first game in Mexico in 2005. In 2007, we had our first London game under the Goodell era. And those have become annual events. I believe we've had a game every year since 2007. More recently, we've broken into other markets. We've started having recurring games in Munich. As you mentioned here, we had one in Sao Paulo and Brazil. And we've also had games in Japan. We've had some in Spain. We had some in Ireland as well. So we've had a lot of games all over the place. So the biggest milestone that we've had recently is reoccurring games in Munich. It's pretty interesting to see these expansions here. There's a theme with some of these teams and these expansions here with Munich and London, kind of the stadiums that they play. I think that's something that we'll talk about later. But with trying to showcase these teams, there's only a select amount of areas that you can really play that are NFL ready or NFL stadium ready, where there's plenty of stadiums in Europe that I think are probably acceptable for sport, but I guess maybe the NFL feels differently about where they want to put these games. So Munich has Bayern Munich, which is one of the most popular teams in Europe. So that's where we played our Munich games. And then Tottenham, with the Tottenham Hotspurs, is where the Bears actually played. And then in the future, we'll be moving into Madrid, which I think will be very exciting too, which is where we'll be playing in the Real Madrid stadium. So I think all of these things are kind of cool to look at.
Have you seen that Bayern Munich stadium?
Really cool.
Beautiful really cool stadium.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you hit on, the potential teams and places that we even expand to are going to be places that have all of this infrastructure built out before. Very strategic placements of teams in places like London, which Goodell said he thinks actually could support 2 NFL teams today, like currently. Yeah, insane. But like London, Paris, Germany, and potentially Madrid all have kind of infrastructure built out, beautiful stadiums to host these NFL teams. But why do we even want to do this in general? Why would Roger Goodell want to expand? And I think the easy answer, and probably the only answer, is the almighty dollar. Yeah, ka-ching, ka-ching,
Greenbacks,
ka-ching.
baby.
Yeah, some money. Because from the fans' perspective, does my life change that much when I see the Bears on Sunday playing a team in London versus in America? No. Probably changes what time I watch the game at, maybe.
You gotta wake up a little earlier.
Yeah, but I'm not that impacted. But what is impacted is the wallets of every NFL owner and the entire revenue of the league. As we said before, the NFL hopes to reach $25 billion in revenue by 2027. And to reach this goal, you gotta expand your market. Per 2015, they gathered some data on market size of NFL fans outside of the US. They found that Mexico has 23.3 million fans, Brazil has 20 million, UK has 5 million, and that was from 2015. So since then, those numbers have for sure grown exponentially. But there is this huge market of untapped potential of fans that they could be selling tickets to and selling merchandise to that Roger Goodell hopes to eventually capitalize on.
The Munich game, I believe, sold out in 15 minutes when
Isn't that cool?
that game released. Yeah. And I believe actually either the Munich game or one of the London games from this year had the second highest ticket price of any regular season game. So these games are, maybe there's different factors that are leading to the ticket price, but they're in demand in Europe for sure. Exciting.
So covered why we want to do it. We want to make more money. There's a lot of untapped fans that we could be selling merchandise to, tickets to, right? But what would this actually look like? And I think something that people are really latching on to is a leaked comment from an owner, I believe, right? Is that what you heard? Right?
Yeah, it was something similar to that. I think it's all kind of a little bit miscued. So they said in 2023, there was an anonymous league owner who said that the NFL is planning to launch an international division in 2 to 5 years.
Right.
I think the 2025 date got put out from a Pat McAfee interview where Pat McAfee was talking about a super jet that could connect New York to London in 4 hours and putting a timetable on that for 2025. And then he was framing that as a marking point for international expansion. But I mean, we'll get into it later. There's a 0% chance we're going to have 4 new teams in 1 year, but there is momentum heading towards this, it seems like.
Right. And I think if we were to add European teams, this seems like the most logical approach instead of adding one European team, which would just add a lot of scheduling conflicts. That seems like a total mess. How are you going to figure out how that team plays internationally and then home games? It would make sense that you'd want to add 4 teams all at once so they can all play amongst themselves and then come over to the United States selectively. But obviously, huge problems that we're running into is the logistical challenges of traveling and scheduling a bunch of international teams. What would that even look like? And the thing Connor alluded to, and a thing that has started to become more and more popular, is these huge jets that can get from New York to London in 4 hours. That is insane. And these jets would be a huge thing to help getting teams to and from Europe.
There was actually a Concorde flight in the 80s that went from New York to London in under 3 hours.
I saw that. Yeah.
That's insane.
Isn't that insane?
I don't know if that's a commercial
plane. Can't be a pleasant experience. So we've got the international travel figured out, advancements in technology, get to and from Europe faster.
Zipping around.
But where are these teams actually going to be based?
Guys?
Where are they going to go? And I think for that, we can kind of just look to the past 20 years of games where we've been playing. And it seems like London is a clear option, Munich, Paris, and then Madrid. Those would be the 4 options that really stand out to me. Connor already mentioned London's Hotspur Stadium, Munich's Allianz Arena, which if you guys have not seen that stadium before, Bayern Munich plays there. It is absolutely beautiful. And then Madrid's Santiago
Bernabeu,
where Real Madrid plays, another beautiful stadium. And like we hit on before, these would be places that already have that established infrastructure to support very, very competitive soccer teams and obviously have the infrastructure to support an American football team. And those locations are like the distances between states. Traveling to and from that is essentially just traveling to and from states, right? So they're all close enough together that the travel would not be a huge hassle. Connor, you have any thoughts on those 4 locations?
No, I think they all make a lot of sense. Obviously, there hasn't been a Spain game in a bit. So it seems like the most conservative efforts that we've had have been in Mexico, London, and Germany. But obviously, if you were to create a 4-team division, you couldn't put a team in Mexico, you couldn't put a team in Sao Paulo, and then also put teams in Europe. So I think this would point us to Europe here with just doing London, Paris, Munich, and Madrid. It would be interesting to see if you would end up doing 2 teams in London. I feel like if you were to try to expand, you'd really be putting yourself pretty thin if you were to start off London with 2 teams. But overall, it is kind of exciting to think about American football being played in these European stadiums, these grand stadiums where such awesome stuff has happened there before. These legendary stadiums, I think, is very exciting.
A big thing that maybe we'll hit on later is problem with expanding is you're expanding to countries that English is not the native language. Obviously going to France, Spain, or Germany. So maybe an appeal of putting 2 teams in London is maybe that's an easier adjustment for players. Going there than having to go to Germany, will maybe less of a culture shock. Yeah.
Note back to the Barcelona Dragons. Their coach was hired because he was asked, can he speak Barcelonian, which I believe is supposed to be Catalan? Like, that's what the interviewer was meaning to ask. And his response was, I speak a little Spanish. And that's how he got the job. So I thought that was really funny. But yeah, we'll get into it later. But especially thinking about France, non-English speaking countries, interesting to think about the branding and marketing that could go on for non-English speaking countries or, not primary language in English speaking countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last piece of logistics to kind of hammer out is we've got 4 new teams, 52 roster spots. How the heck do you fill all those roster spots? Who the heck is going to be actually playing on these teams? Who are you going to make go to Europe?
Ship off to Europe,
pick up their roots, their family, and their kids, and send them to these European countries. Well, I think for that, you can kind of look to, I'd say more recently, the NHL, who in the last 10 years has added, I think, 3 new teams at least, the Kraken, the Knights, and then the Utah Hockey Club. Obviously a different scenario because those are US-based teams and not European teams, so probably a tougher sell. But in those examples, the way it worked was every team would essentially protect X amount of players on their team. They'd say, okay, I'm the Chicago Blackhawks. You cannot take Connor Bedard from us, right? We're going to designate a list of players that are not up for grabs. And then the rest of those players are put into a draft pool that the new team now gets their pickings from. And there's certain regulations and rules for which players you can and cannot protect and how that lays out. And it was kind of essentially the same way with the Texans, with how that expansion team worked. Teams would essentially, they would list 5 players that they would put up for draft by the Texans. And this was a draft done before the actual NFL draft. And then come NFL draft time, I believe the Texans were given the number 1 pick. It was funny, in 2002, apparently the restrictions, you said you couldn't put up a punter or a kicker as one of your five players. I think it's funny if you just put up like, okay, you can have our long snapper, you can have our punter or kicker.
And they also couldn't be unrestricted free agents next year, which was really funny too. Like these had to be real players that you were going to be on your team next year. You couldn't just put up your junk players. But even still, reading into this, it was funny to hear that the 2002 expansion draft ended up being an opportunity for many NFL GMs to salary dump their expensive players who didn't pan out, which probably was a very helpful thing for a lot of these franchises to say, oh, I can just get rid of this player by putting him in the expansion draft. Yeah, where do I sign? But these expansion drafts always end up being very interesting because with the Golden Knights especially, it might not sound like it, but when you put this team together of all, 6th best players on teams, the team can end up being fairly competent within the first year. That the Golden Knights were competing very early on in their time, right?
They made the Stanley Cup
within,
within like 2 or 3 years of being a team.
Exactly, right? Insane. So these teams can end up being pretty interesting early on. But yeah, these expansion drafts, man, they're really fun.
But it'd be interesting now with adding, in this hypothetical scenario, adding 4 teams at once, how you even expand. You have to have each team give up 10 players or something, elect 10 players. It's 320 players in this draft pool to split amongst, 4 teams. And then also moving forward, now if you have 36 teams in the NFL, what does that look like for the draft? Is 7 rounds of 36 players each round enough? Probably not. Probably going to need to add a couple more rounds or split up the draft. It'd be a real shakeup for how players are drafted. Okay, so now let's talk about actual problems. So we've laid out what it would look like, how it would work, but now we kind of haven't really hit on what the actual problems are of expanding to Europe.
It's been a lot of sunshine rainbows so far.
Yeah, why we haven't done it yet and why attempts to do it usually fail. And the first and most obvious one is time zone differences. Europe is like 7 hours ahead of us. And you see this a lot with other sports in Europe that are popular here, like soccer, like Formula One. Time zone differences make it very hard for not only players, but also broadcasting viewership, right? A lot of these games are being broadcasted at weird times, very early in the morning, which would probably have huge consequences to these huge contracts that they have for TV deals, right? And trying to schedule games that appeal to both a European market and an American market would be very difficult. But then also, other than just a viewership standpoint, it'd be incredibly difficult for this time zone difference for the players, right? The European games are already difficult enough for players because it has such a huge impact to their sleep schedule, their routine, right? They're getting thrown off by going down, huge time difference, coming back, throws everything off. So now when you have teams that only are based out of Europe, and now you have teams going to and from Europe to play them, it seems like a logistical nightmare.
There was, in 2023, there was a rumor that the mayor of London and maybe even the NFL was floating out the idea of having the Super Bowl in London. It's like
insane.
A rumor that came out in 2023. Think about the logistics there of what time the game would need to start in London. It would need to start at 9 p.m. at night in order to line up with an American viewing schedule is insane to think about. And when you start to dig through that, the logistics of it can feel like a nightmare. And especially thinking about training camp, even in the off season, teams often do joint practices with one another. Players are often not with the team all the time. They're doing their own training elsewhere. You would think that maybe they need to have home bases in the United States to make it more convenient for young players who are just entering the league. The logistics of this can really start to feel daunting. But I will say the NFL has been playing games abroad for a long time now. They've gotten better at it. I think this is a problem that if they really are interested in it, they could solve it for sure.
Seems like a problem that they could fix if it means billions of dollars in increased revenue. I think another interesting problem that we have is actually getting the players to want to play in Europe, right? It's different for the NBA. We have the Toronto Raptors. We got to get players to go to Canada. But having teams in Europe, now you have in an NFL draft, you have 19, 20, 21-year-olds that have lived in the U.S. their whole lives that have to pick up their whole lives and now are shipped off to Europe to potentially play in countries where English is not the native language. There's huge cultural differences. That seems like a very tough sell for rookies, and an even tougher sell for veterans who have spent their entire career in the United States, have raised families, have houses in the United States. And now, I mean, with how fast players can get moved around, having to tell people to pick up their lives and go to Germany seems insane.
Could you imagine telling Mercedes Lewis that you have to go to Madrid now to play for your remaining, to be offsides in Madrid now?
Yeah, and especially practice squad players that are signed and then cut very fast, and you're bopping around all these different teams. Sounds horrific. In our research, we found a specific example in the NHL of the Quebec Nordics. Connor brought this to my attention. Connor, do you want to hit on this real quick?
Yeah. So the Quebec, I believe it's Nordiques. It looks like Nordics, but
okay, Nordiques.
Pronounce it seems like the Quebec Nordiques. So the Quebec Nordiques were an NHL franchise from 1979 to 1995 and eventually became the Colorado Avalanche, or what's currently the Colorado Avalanche. So the main issue that started to arise with the Nordiques was the market and language barriers that was existing in Quebec. And the biggest example of this is Eric Lindros, who in 1991, Quebec had the #1 pick in the NHL draft. And Eric Lindros was supposed to be the projected #1 pick. And he made it very clear pre-draft that he was not going to go to Quebec.
Nah, I'm
For a
good.
number of reasons. He said that the distance, the lack of marketing potential, because Quebec is not an English speaking area. So the marketing potential for this player would be very low. And his refusal to speak French were all reasons that he did not want to go to Quebec. Despite this, they still drafted him with the number one overall pick. He wouldn't wear the jersey on draft night. He refused to wear the jersey of the Nordiques on draft day in protest of being drafted. As soon as he was drafted, he started to hold out, and he did not play his entire first season for Quebec, and he was eventually traded the next year to the Flyers. This is an example of what you can point to of even as close as Quebec, which is touching the Canada is touching the United States, players will not be interested in doing this. And, maybe it was in the 90s, so maybe there's a different sentiment around traveling and going internationally, but it's a real concern to think, will the players actually want to play here? And will the players be willing to do this, pick up their whole lives, learn a different language, or be just surrounded in a culture that does not speak English natively? And even the marketing opportunities, all of this is stuff to consider that you just don't think about now when everything is based in the United States. So I feel like Quebec is an interesting example to kind of point to and say, well, this is what happens with international expansion, and this is some of the risks that can come with it. At the end of the day, players just might not be that interested in going across to Europe.
And then the last problem that we have is we've had 32 teams for the last 22 years since the Texans joined. Adding 4 new teams would really shake up this nice constructed situation that we have of our 8 divisions of 4 teams, right? Now you've potentially got to add maybe 6 divisions of 6 teams or 9 divisions of 4 teams. Like that doesn't make sense. Figuring out how to fit these teams into the structure of the NFL would mean potentially messing up a lot of rivalries, switching around teams, kind of messing up the feng shui that we've got going on right now. And then also,
a good thing going right now.
Yeah. The huge concern that you see, that you touched on at the start, Connor, that we see with the XFL, that you see with other football products, is you spend all this money, you spend all this effort creating these European teams, and they're just not competitive enough. The end result is not good enough. Maybe because of the time difference, the time difference, maybe the drafts don't work, maybe team players don't want to go to Europe, the good players don't want to go, and now you just have teams in Europe that get stomped every time, and it's not competitive. That is a real possibility. And this seems to be Goodell's biggest concern, because I think logistics, like we've hit on before, NFL can figure that out. They've got a lot of really talented people and have been trying out logistics for a while. But at the end of the day, if the teams aren't competitive enough and people don't care about the teams, there's not a market for them, and they just stink, then it's going to be a huge, huge flop. The problem with that is you kind of got to have the teams to see if they're going to be competitive. There's no in between there, right? You actually have to do the teams to see if they're going to be competitive.
No, exactly. You can't. The risk that's running there is if you implement these teams, in order to implement 4 teams, the league is going to have to go through such a transformation, right? It'll be a serious offseason or maybe multi-year process to, one, reconstruct conferences and divisions, to also supplement drafts, set up infrastructure in Europe for these teams. And then if the market just doesn't respond well to it based off of competitiveness or just the inability to fight market share with soccer, they could just totally flop. And then you can't walking back all of these changes would seem like a nightmare, right? All of this is just very interesting. And you can even think about just basic differences in the European interpretation of football. There was a good video that I watched from Frank Michael Smith where he went to a European, one of the Jags games in London, where he was talking about certain differences in watching people in London watch a football game. One of the interesting things was parking, right? And tailgates. Like tailgates is not a thing in soccer for European football fans. Instead, they usually just hang out at pubs before the game, then walk to the games or take the tube to these games. Whereas if you think about, he pointed out the Niners, Levi's Stadium is 40 miles away from San Francisco solely for the parking. When Chicago released their newest rendition of the Soldier Field renovations, all anybody talked about was parking, right? Just the dynamic of implementing this league internationally, there's a completely different cultural dynamic that is going to exist. Even in Sao Paulo, when we were playing in the Corinthians stadium, the ST Corinthians, with the color green, right? Like all these cultural things where we put two teams, the Packers and the Eagles, who are predominantly green, and Corinthians, the Sao Paulo team, famously is very against the color green. There's so many of these culture things that I feel like we might not be considering, or even if they're going to respond well to this. But the only way to see it and really to prove it is to go through a big league transformation in implementing these teams. It's an extremely risky thing to do, and it does seem like Goodell is seriously interested in doing this. But I feel like the ambition behind this is insane. To actually do this, I feel like would be an extremely ambitious and honestly wild thing to do.
In general, because we can kind of open it up in general to what you think of expansions, adding new teams, what you think. I think there's an argument to be made for people that I think from my perspective, I would say, would my life as an NFL viewer change for the better with adding new teams in Europe? And I would say probably not. I would think if you were to add 4 new teams to the NFL, that in my mind would dilute the talent of each team, right? And potentially hurt the end product, right? And with all of the potential negatives that we said, like the huge time differences, the stress on players, I think the end result might hurt what we currently have, hurt the product of current NFL football. For me as a fan that is not getting any financial benefits from expanding the teams, I wouldn't really like that, right? I'm pretty happy with the 32 team thing. And if moving to Europe means having a worse product on the field, I think I would be against that. I think it is an inevitable move by the NFL and by owners that want to make more money, and Goodell, whose job it is to make this league more money to go abroad. But from my perspective, I think I could live without teams in Europe. I think it's cool on the surface, but when you dig deep and think about the implications it could have to players and what we see on the field, I think I would be against it. Connor, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree. It seems like something that will stay relevant moving forward, or at least will always be a talking point. I still believe that an expansion team in general will be very difficult. Even thinking about, teams talk about having a team in Austin, right? Or expanding into other cities in Texas, right? Even thinking of one expansion team, it's very difficult to actually implement an expansion team. So implementing 4 seems like there'd be so many hurdles to do. I think you look at the league now, there's 7 decent quarterbacks that exist in the entire world. To now try to add 4 more teams, I think it's very difficult to think about how you would fill these rosters with talent to be able to compete. And another thing, like, I think it was projected that owners would profit across the league something like $20 billion from an expansion into Europe, right? And I think it hits on similar points of private equity, right? Where it's great that you hear that the league is growing, and you hear that team valuations are growing, and you think that's great, right? The NFL is becoming a more profitable sport, and the team valuations are increasing. But then I feel like you take a step back and you think, well, why is that a good thing? That teams are more valuable, that the NFL is creating more money, that owners are making more money. I feel like it gets harder to think about it should always come back to the fans, right? It gets harder to think about how the end product is changing for fans, right? And I feel like this is an example where the end product is not going to improve from expanding into Europe. It's going to change. It's going to allow there to be more fans, but the actual product will not be enhanced. So I think it's another thing where, you might be putting different priorities in terms of football. And the last thing would say, there's been such a push in the NFL lately about player safety, with obviously Damar Hamlin having his issue 2 years ago, and then Chris Olave dealing with concussion issues. It's the main talking point, right? There's no way that the NFL could legitimately say that they believe in player safety if they expand to an 18-game schedule and also start promoting games in Europe where they're asking players to go through 11-hour time changes on the week and then to also be playing more games. I think it's ridiculous, and it kind of just starts to show the different priorities that the league has. But I mean, at the end of the day, Roger Goodell is hired to expand the league. The owners promote him because they believe he can expand the NFL, and he's done an incredible job in doing it. And this is his job, right? So it seems like his main goal moving forward seems like expanding the NFL internationally, and it seems like he's going to at least try to do this. You can't get mad at him specifically for trying to do what he's hired to do. But overall, I think I agree. I wouldn't be that. I think it would be cool in the newness of it, where it's like, oh, cool, we have teams in Europe. But then to actually think about going a step further than that, I think it starts to lose some of the luster that it has. And it seemed like in the past, the main reason leagues failed internationally was because of the competitiveness of the teams.
Right.
And now we are trying to fill, this would be filling 4 teams with seemingly non-competitive rosters. It seems exactly like you would be repeating what you've seen before, unless you really make a different supplemental draft, you really shake things up. It seems like it'll be pointing down the wrong direction and it will not succeed again. But I guess we'll see.
Well, I think that's all I got for this episode. It was a very good episode. I had a great time talking about this, great time researching it. Always interesting to kind of learn a little bit about, I think, the business side of football, learn a little bit more about the history of the NFL, what we have tried before, never knew about these European leagues that we've tried and failed at. And then kind of thinking of the NFL as more of a business was interesting. Yeah, that's all I got. Connor, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think that's the main thing. At the end of the day, it's a business. Goodell's going to try to run this like a business. And if expanding into Europe means that there's more profit coming in the league, then I think it's an inevitable decision, no matter the impact that it has on the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that'll do it for today's episode of the Chicagolandians. If you made it to the end of this episode, first of all, thank you. And second of all, if you liked this episode, why not leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? And if you want more Chicagolandians content, you can find us on most social media platforms, including Twitter/X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Chicagolandians. And as always, we end this by saying, bear down.
Bear down.
Ooh.